Oh, hello. I forgot you were there for a moment. Over the last year and a half, we've learned so much about the technique of conducting. We've learned what to do with the right hand, what to do with the left hand. We've learned about where the orchestra sits. We've learned how to walk on and off stage. Now we're going to get to the really serious part. Over the next 3 lessons, together, you and I are going to learn the 7th Symphony by Beethoven. We're going to discover how the conductor actually prepares for a performance. Where do you start? What do you need to know in advance, even before you open the music? Well, it certainly helps to know a little bit about the history of the composer. There are numerous biographies, probably ranging at this point to well over 500. And they speculate about what he intended. They use the letters he wrote, the people who were in contact with him. And this is only one example, a recent Beethoven biography by the distinguished author Jan Swafford. It comes in at about 1,000 pages. There are other biographies that go on for 2-3 volumes. But read one of them. Get to know a little bit about the composer, the time he lived in, what was going on socially, politically, and culturally, and what his impact was. That's a good start. As a conductor, we also have reference points. Beethoven was a conductor, apparently not very good. Conducting was only starting. But we can learn a few things from other books that are written. Here's one. This is by Sir George Grove. He's responsible for something called the Grove Dictionary of Music. And this one puts Beethoven and his symphonies into perspective, taking one symphony at a time and analyzing them, letting us know what is contained within those great works. So now between a bio and a discussion of the symphonies, we have pretty much the background and history we need. We also have volumes that are devoted to actually conducting these pieces. I got this one when I was a student. No, I didn't write it. I know it says my name's on it. Who wrote it was Felix Weingartner. And he talks about his time as a conductor doing the Beethoven symphonies. We're talking here about basically the turn of the 20th century. A bit more recent is this, by another conductor and musicologist named Norman Del Mar. He went through all the Beethoven works and gave us a volume about how to conduct them. These are helpful, but they are other people's opinions, based primarily on the texts they were working from. What do you mean, texts? Just as there are many books about Beethoven and how to conduct it, there are equally as many editions of Beethoven symphonies. Clearly, if you have the time and energy and want to put in a little research, you go online and you look at the manuscripts. They're all available. You can see what Beethoven wrote, and you can make decisions based on what you think he meant. And then there are those early publication of his symphonies, full of all kinds of errors and mistakes. And then there are more contemporaneous versions. Here's one. Beethoven 7th Symphony. Score and a book of critical commentary done by Norman Delmar's son. Here's one by Igor Markevich. Score, critical commentary. So far, we haven't looked at one note of this piece. All we've done is give ourselves some background. Putting together everything that we've discussed over our previous lessons, let's dive into this work, leaving aside for the moment all these tomes, all these analyses, and let's see what the conductor has to do to learn this piece. Well, Beethoven Symphony No. 7. We don't have an instrumentation list, at least not in this particular edition, but we do have a listing of the instruments as they occur on the title page. We see 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, corni, that's horns, in A, we'll get to that in a second. Trombe, that's trumpets, in D. Timpani, it says in A and E. And then the strings, violins, viola, cello, and bass. These are the instruments that will play during the course of this piece. Before we begin our study, we have to consider the style in which we're going to perform. It's fairly easy these days to go back, listen to recordings from over 100 years ago. And you'll see that performance practice and traditions have changed. It's now argued that we can actually play these pieces in a manner similar to the way they were played in Beethoven's time. So just listening to different recordings already gives us an idea about how music evolves, and perhaps gives us some indication as to how we might want to approach this music. I'm a child of the 50s, basically. I grew up hearing the music in what could roughly be called the post-Romantic era. It was the time of Toscanini, but it was also the time of Furtwängler, 2 conductors in opposite poles in terms of how they approached the work. The score that I'm using for our purposes, as you will see, has no markings in it. We're going to approach it fresh. But other conductors, they love to mark things. Here's an example of Gustav Mahler. Different colors, changing notes, adding crescendos, putting in accents. That was the tradition at the turn of the 19th century. It was to make the piece your own as a conductor. Today, we tend to think of all this music as being more reflective of the composer and his time. Well, that's not entirely true. After all, we don't come to the concert hall in horse-driven carriages. We don't play the music with candles illuminating us along the way. And we certainly don't wear those powdered wigs anymore. So for me, my approach tends to be one that respects what I believe to be the composer's intent, but geared for the audience of today. Our concert halls are much larger, and our orchestras are really much larger. So here we are, the first page. The first instruction we need to see is, how fast does it go? Usually, we see andante, adagio, allegro, all those fun Italian words. But what does it say in Beethoven 7? Poco sostenuto, a little sustained. That's not a tempo. Ah, but Beethoven gives us a metronome mark. But even that's controversial. The metronome wasn't invented until Beethoven got around to his 8th symphony. So any works prior to that piece are thinking about the tempos in retrospect. That means that when Beethoven is writing a metronome mark in his 1st symphony, many, many years have passed since the time when he composed the piece. Our feeling of tempo. And here, although it says that the quarter note equals 69, maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. Instruments were played differently back then than they are now. And that tempo marking may have been fine when Beethoven first heard this piece, but it may not be fine now. So the first decision you have to make is based on how fast or slow do you think this introduction is going to go. Are there any clues? Is there somewhere in this piece of music that can give us an idea as to what our tempo might be? And the answer is yes, but it's not on the opening page. All we see on the opening page are some strong chords and some long lyric lines, usually given over to the woodwinds. Where do we get our tempo from? It's going to be on the 2nd page. What you see on this page are a series of 16th notes. You can choose to play which would tell you that the opening is going to be jam, ba, ba, ba. Or you can choose to play it slower. But this is what you have to think about when you conduct the very first bar. What about that first bar? Let's go back and take a look. We see these quarter notes. And we also see that in very small print, there is a dot over them. What does the dot mean? Normally, we think the dot means short. We don't know how short. If he had wanted it really crisp, he could have written an 8th note or even a 16th. But he didn't. He wrote a quarter note with a dot. Not only that, but if you look at the violin and viola parts, what you see is they have more than one note to play. In the case of the violins, 4 notes. Now you have to make a decision. Do you want each violinist to play all 4 notes, which they cannot do in one stroke, meaning they would have to play like that? Or you can do it in what we call divisi, perhaps with half of the section playing the first 2 notes and the other half playing the lower notes. And then your question is, where does the top note fall? Does it fall on the downbeat, with the other notes being just a little bit before? Or perhaps the first note, the low note, is played on the downbeat, meaning the top notes come just a little bit later. It's your call. As far as the length goes, you have to decide how long you think is appropriate. I guess it's like the difference between something being noble or something being aggressive. We see that the oboe solo has a forte piano on the first note, but basically it's piano in a lyric line that is taking place. So as a conductor, supposing you wanted it to be long and noble in all those other instruments, it would be like this. Yeah. And if you wanted it to be short and aggressive, it would be like that. So that's a decision you have to make. All the while, you're thinking not about the opening in terms of the tempo, but you're thinking of those 16th notes. Ya ta 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 ta. Yeah. And that gives the orchestra a feeling of security as to where to place the first note. It happens again in the third bar. It happens again in the fifth bar. And it happens again in the seventh bar. But now you've established your tempo. You can be consistent, and you can show the kind of loud sound you want, whether that short sound or that more noble one. But you don't have to be as exaggerated as you were for the very opening. Let's look at the clarinet part in the third bar. It appears to be what the oboe has in the first and second bar, but there's a big difference. You'll notice that there are stems that go up and down from the notes. Those stems tell us how many of the clarinets are playing. When it's one stem, that's one player. But here, you see one up and one down. That means that two clarinets are playing, creating a potential intonation problem. It has to sound as if it's a solo instrument, like the oboe, but it also has to have a kind of really clean and beautiful sonority that is compatible with what's been heard in the first bar. When you're conducting, you must listen to this to make sure that the sound is not so different as to take away from the overall structure of what Beethoven is trying to write at the beginning. And then 2 bars later, the horns get it. Those same 4 notes. Remember when I said we were going to discuss what it means when we see clarinets in A and horns in A? It's transposition, just like ones we talked about in an earlier lesson. The clarinet part, if you just look at it and it didn't say anything, we would assume that's a G natural. And indeed, the clarinets see that in front of them, a G natural. But they have to use a different mouthpiece because the instrument is pitched a little bit differently than the others. In reality, that note will sound as if it was an E natural, a minor third lower than written. That's the instrument Beethoven chose for this. Why? Because the symphony is in the key of A major, and the clarinets in A and the horns in A make it possible for them to play notes that are available to Beethoven and might not have been if they used a different instrument. And when we see the trumpets in D, it means Beethoven is telling us that all he needs are the notes available to the trumpets that are pitched in that key. They don't have chromatic valves yet. They are limited in the number of notes that they can play. So now we know about the first 8 bars or so. What happens when we get to bar 7? We have that same strong first beat, whether noble or short. But now something changes. In the middle of the bar, you have piano played by the strings. What has disappeared? The dots. No longer are these short notes. They're full-length quarters. And so the character and the color of these notes is very different than anything that has come before with the string instruments. And now you get to decide about the bowing. But wait a minute. What if you're not a string player? What if you don't know? That's why you have a concertmaster. Concertmaster can guide you through these. The good thing about strings and bowings is you can say something, I'd like that up, I'd like that down, and you're going to be right 50% of the time. It can only be that way. For me, I like these nice notes played all on up bows just because it creates a lovely sonority. And then we come to the last bar on this first page. We have the instruction, Diminuendo, from the composer. We are going from piano, and so the diminuendo has to go to a dynamic that's going to be softer than that. We haven't turned the page, so we haven't discovered what that's going to be. But it can only be one of 2 possibilities in Beethoven's time. Either it's going to be pianissimo, or it's going to be triple piano. And the likelihood of triple piano in Beethoven is somewhat rare. But again, I would call your attention to the fact that when you get to those 16th notes at the very end of the page, there are no dots. That becomes important because one of the things a conductor has to do is to tell the orchestra whether or not he or she would like notes played on the string or off the string. 2 very different kinds of sound. And what dictates that in this piece is probably what's on the next page. Let's see. Aha! Down to pianissimo. But now there are dots on those 16th notes. Another decision for the conductor. Are the 4 notes before meant to be played longer? Is it da 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 yap ba 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 ba? Possibly. Maybe, even though Beethoven didn't put dots on them, it can be ya da 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 ba 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 ba. Lots to think about. There are very few bars in any piece of music by any composer where the conductor doesn't have to make a decision. If you're a violinist, a pianist, a singer, you're going to spend hours figuring out these things for yourself, for your individual instrument. But as a conductor, you have to be the one to tell everyone how you wish them to play. You might get asked questions by the orchestra. Excuse me, Maestro, would you like that on or off the string? Do you want that longer or shorter, louder or softer? You have to be prepared to answer every one of those questions. And the way you do it is by listening to what the orchestra did as you were playing. Try to make sure that while they were playing, you paid attention to what they were doing. There are 2 performances that are going on. One is the one in your head, and the other is the one that the members of the orchestra are doing. At a rehearsal, your job is to be a little bit objective and really understand what's happening on the stage and find a way to balance how you play and coordinate your thoughts with the same ideas that the orchestra has. So we barely got through the first page. We spent a lot of time looking at the decisions we have to make. We really only did one example of how to conduct, and that was for the opening chord. Your assignment is to get through this introduction, the whole thing, not the movement, just the introduction, and see if you can apply what we've talked about to every bar and every note that you see in front of you. Doesn't mean you have to hear it in your head yet. We're just looking at it to see what makes sense. If you know the Beethoven 7th Symphony, maybe your job is easier, maybe it's harder. Maybe you heard a performance via recording that so impressed you, you wanted to imitate was on it. But then you look at the score and you discover that that particular conductor did something different than you wanted it to be, or that was in the score and was changed. And yes, a lot of conductors make a lot of changes. We'll be discussing that in the future. But for now, just see if you can make your way through this incredible introduction and make decisions about bowings, phrasings, long versus short, loud versus soft. And when we meet again, we will continue our journey through this piece as we begin to understand the world of the Beethoven 7th Symphony.